Okay, so first we are going to cover the part of World War II um, with Japan. And as the textbook, which covers this, uh, has it all over in different areas of the chapter. But I'm going to begin with uh, the part of the war with Japan. And these identifications are going to be focusing on the part of the war with Japan. So the monumental event that occurred that brought the United States into World War II, which was already raging across the world uh, for 2 to 3 years, or even 4 years, if you include when China was invaded by Japan. So and then the war was going in full swing in Europe with Nazi Germany at this time. So Hitler had already started invading many countries and started the Holocaust, slave labor, all kinds of horrible things were already occurring across the world. But Roosevelt had kept the United States out of the war completely until December 7th, 1941. And so Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th, 1941, which was the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, the military and Navy base of the United States. So here you see a map of what was going on before Pearl Harbor and what Japan was doing, which was a military dictator. Japan was a military dictatorship at the time. Its emperor was pretty much helpless, and the military had been running Japan, and they had become an aggressive dictatorship bent on conquering all the countries in Southeast Asia, especially China, but many other places also. And so Japan had already uh, conquered and violently occupied many of these countries. Uh, and because of that, the United States and Franklin Roosevelt was very upset of the violence that was going on. And the president tried to cut off oil supplies to the Japanese by trying to stop at least some of the sales of oil because it was all being used in military conquest. So Japan decided to take out the United States Navy by attacking Pearl Harbor, and they believed they were much stronger. And indeed, they had a much stronger. Japan had a much stronger navy than the United States had in 1941. The United States had pretty much been a neutral, almost isolationist country. So this is when Japan made the plan to attack Pearl Harbor. So on December 7th, 1941, um, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and there's been a number of films made about this. One a few years ago, which was partly a romantic film called Pearl Harbor, but it showed a lot of what was going on also, um, and many other films. But the attack occurred, and it totally took the United States by surprise. Um, and the radar even thought it was just uh, American planes doing practice. So there was a full-fledged attack. Japan Navy traveled almost 4,000 miles to do this, and remember there was no advanced radar or other ways, so the United States had no idea these ships were traveling towards Hawaii, and the U.S. had a small navy, so there was really no way to see them. There were a few ships, like I said earlier, around Howland Island, but the sneak attack was very successful. As you can see, 169 aircraft were destroyed in the U.S. airfields in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, and about 150 more were damaged. Uh, and it says here on this chart, casualties were 3,478. So here's some pictures of the actual attack. The Japanese Air Force was flying off of aircraft carriers and pretty much at will sinking American ships docked in the harbor and early in the morning. And the soldiers in the Navy really were not prepared. And most of the planes that the U.S. had there were destroyed on the ground. A few heroic pilots tried to take up planes on their own to fight, uh, but were massively outnumbered by Japanese planes. Here's another ship being sunk. Um, all told, 8 U.S. battleships were destroyed, and over 2,400 American servicemen were killed that day. You can see here some quickly arranged shootings. Some of them are just looking up in the sky, uh, possibly between waves. But these weapons you see aimed were way overmatched by the Japanese Air Force. So, the next day you see uh, newspapers across the United States were covering the attack, and it basically began a huge change in American history. The radio broadcasts in America were describing this Japanese attack, and it mobilized the United States into fighting against the Japanese war machine. It greatly mobilized them. The newspapers, um, people were reading this shocked the next day and hearing it on the radio. Um, one of the bad, all right, so we see here that where Hawaii, Pearl Harbor is, and you see California. And one of the bad things that resulted in this was Japanese civilians who were kind of Japanese American civilians who were caught in the middle. So there were some Japanese American civilians living on Pearl Harbor and in Hawaii, and then a large amount of Japanese American civilians living in California. So that's one of the sad parts of this tale, also, because Roosevelt, when some advisors, as time went by after this, agreed to Japanese civilians having to go, some of them going to internment camps. And I've done a little reading of the diaries of these internment camps. Some of the Japanese civilians, not really in the East Coast or Midwest, but those in California had to go to internment camps for 3 to 4 years. And these camps were nothing like Hitler's death camps. That no one was dying. I think 10 people died from violence over a 4 year period. But the problem, and I've done some reading on this, the problem with these internment camps was most people who were there wrote in their diaries was the lack of privacy, generally poor, conditions. I mean, they had, food supplies and some school and classes, but almost all of them said that the ones who went there that there was just a complete lack of privacy. It was dormitory barracks and open washroom shower areas, and this is what people who lived through it hated the most. And certainly that's a regret of um, Roosevelt had done many great things as president, but this one, uh, looking back, should not have been done. And the justifications that there could be spies or that maybe other Americans might attack Japanese civilians is pretty unjustified because um, if the Japanese civilians felt threatened, they could have voluntarily gone to the camps. And the idea of spies, there wouldn't have been many. And even though there was an attack on Oregon, of all places, people really were afraid of attacks. A Japanese airplane bombed the Oregon forest trying to start a forest fire, but the forest fire didn't begin. So anyway, that's some coverage of the internment camps. But in many other ways, the country changed also. A country that had stayed out of World War II and had tried to remain peaceful, now was reading about Oahu, Hawaii being bombed, and the slaughter that Americans went through in Pearl Harbor. It really did change the attitudes of Americans in many different ways. And the biggest thing, of course, was that it brought the United States into World War II. And you see here, 1,500 dead in Hawaii, Congress votes war. And actually, we know now that the number was quite a bit higher than 1,500 Americans that died. Um, so the Congress voted for war, and now the United States entered World War II. Again, Congress declares war on Japan. We see here Roosevelt talking to the radio stations, um, basically saying that America was now in World War II. And also, a strange thing happened. At the same time, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States, which probably was a military mistake on his part, because the United States may have been totally focused on fighting the war in Japan, but by Hitler declaring war on the United States, trying to get U.S. when it was down, and he was an ally of Japan. He was the ally of fascist Italy and Imperial Japan. So he may have been entering the war as an ally, but also to try and demoralize the country. But instead, it brought America into the war, not just against Japan, but now the United States was into the war against Nazi Germany, which was truly a world war now. As you can see, it mobilized the country. Uh, Here you see 60,000 men enlisted in just a few weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So there were literally lines at Army recruitment centers across the country. And as the months went by, it was many more than 60,000 men enlisted. Here you see a line of young men uh, volunteering to fight, and a draft was started, but uh, conscripting people into conscripting them into the army, but it wasn't really needed. There was a huge volunteer force. And you had young men, sometimes saying they were 18 when they were really 17 or 16, and you had newlywed men joining, leaving many young mothers behind without a father for the children. It really changed the fabric of the country, and many didn't never came back, died in the war, or were gone for 4 years. Here you see another recruitment center. Uh, Men and women were volunteering and joining up for different branches of the military and government, to nursing and many other areas, because of this huge wave of patriotism that started in a war. And people felt as if it was no gray in this war, that it was a war of self-defense, which it clearly was a war of self-defense. Uh, See here other pilots. This is not right after Pearl Harbor, but people from all across the country were joining the air services, which would be like the Air Force now, the Navy, the Army, Coast Guard. Um, some joining the Army. We see a wave of patriotism across people across the country. It was really a radical change in the era. We see here young women who had joined to become nurses. and called the WAG, the WACs, and many other services in this wave of patriotism, and also the desire to defend the country. And then many had to go through basic. You see soldiers going quickly through basic training because many of them had joined and were sent to the fight in the Pacific, where the Japanese are sent to fight in North Africa against the Nazis and in various places around the world, and eventually fighting in Europe against the Nazis. Um, you had women joining and doing many things within the services. Um, Campus volunteers, I'm going to assume this is a college, and students are enlisting to work within the Defense Service. Some young women were flying planes and um, volunteering to be pilots. Not a lot of the pilots were, but some. There were some pilots doing various jobs um, in airplanes. So here you see Franklin Roosevelt's famous quote, "A day which will live in infamy," December 7, 1941, which in review brought the United States into World War II and mobilized the country. And now the United States was in the war versus Japan, versus Italy, and versus Nazi Germany.